The lieutenant colonel did not expect an answer when he asked the question. That was the truth of it, even if he would never have admitted it standing there in front of 32 officer cadets on a cold October morning at CFB Gagetown, New Brunswick. He had asked the question the way men in positions of authority sometimes ask questions. Not to receive an answer, but to make a point about the absence of one. The question was this: can anyone here navigate to grid reference 447881 by dead reckoning alone? No GPS, no compass, in full whiteout conditions, and reach the emergency cache within 4 hours. He let it sit there in the cold air. The cadets stood in 2 rows along the edge of the tree line, their breath coming in small white clouds, their faces doing the thing young faces do when they are being tested, and they know it, a careful, tactical blankness that is meant to look like calm. Most of them were in their mid-20s. A few were younger. They had all scored in the top percentile of their intake cohort. They had GPS units on their belts, compasses on their wrists, and 4 weeks of land navigation phase behind them. They were, by every institutional measure, the best candidates the regiment had seen in years. Not one of them raised their hand. Lieutenant Colonel Grant Mercer let the silence run. He was good at that. He had been an officer for 23 years, and he had learned early that silence was a tool, that it had weight and shape, that you could use it the way a carpenter uses a level, to show a man exactly where he was leaning. He was about to speak when he noticed something at the far edge of the parade area. There was a man standing there beside a maintenance truck, holding a thermos. He was perhaps 70 years old, maybe older. He wore a faded green work jacket with the base maintenance logo on the chest, and the kind of canvas trousers that have been washed so many times they have no colour left to give. His hair was white and close-cropped, and there was something in the way he was standing. Not at attention, not casual either, but that particular stillness that belongs to men who have spent years being very careful about when and how they move. That caught Mercer's eye. The man had raised his hand. Not urgently, not to call attention to himself. He had raised it the way you might raise a hand in a quiet room, to indicate that yes, you'd like some more coffee. A small, unhurried gesture that seemed to belong to a different conversation entirely. And then, when he saw Mercer looking at him, he lowered it again slowly and looked off toward the tree line as if he had merely been stretching. Somebody among the cadets laughed. It was a short, involuntary sound, not cruel exactly, but thoughtless, which is sometimes worse. Corporal Trent Ashby, standing third from the left, turned his head toward the sound, and then back toward the old man, and then back toward Mercer, reading the room the way cadets learn to read rooms. "With respect, sir," Ashby said, not quite keeping the smile out of his voice, "I think the groundskeeper might be volunteering." Mercer looked at the man by the maintenance truck. The man was looking at the tree line. "What's your name?" Mercer called across the parade area. The man turned. "Gilles," he said. "Gilles Trepanier, base maintenance." He said it without apology, without any particular emphasis, as if it were simply information being relayed from one party to another. "You've been listening to the briefing, Mr. Trepanier?" "Some of it," Gilles said. "I was changing a fuel filter. Sound carries." Mercer studied him for a moment. 23 years in the Canadian Forces had given him a particular instinct about men, not infallible, nothing is but reliable in the way that a well-maintained instrument is reliable. He looked at Gilles Trepanier's hands. He looked at the way the man's weight was distributed across his feet. He looked at the stillness in him. "You know where grid 447881 is?" Mercer asked. "I know that country," Gilles said, and left it at that. One of the other cadets, a young woman named Cadet Sandra Vitale, who had finished top of her navigation practical the previous week, and who had, privately, been composing her answer to the question in her head for the last 30 seconds, turned to look at the old man with the thermos, and for a reason she could not have explained at the time. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Trepanier, I'm going to ask you something, and I'd ask you to take it in the spirit it's intended." He paused. "What makes you think you can do what none of these candidates has volunteered to do?" Gilles looked at him. There was no offence in his face, and no false modesty either. "I didn't say I could," Gilles said. "I said I know that country." He picked up his thermos, screwed the lid back on and waited. There are moments in a man's life, in any life, where something shifts without announcement. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in the kind of stories people like to tell. Just a quiet internal reorientation, like a compass needle finding north after being held too close to a magnet. Grant Mercer had one of those moments standing on the edge of the Gagetown tree line with 32 cadets at his back and an old maintenance worker looking at him with patient, undramatic eyes. "All right," Mercer said, "show us." What happened next is worth telling slowly, because the people who were there would spend years telling it quickly, and something gets lost when you do that. The group moved out at 09:15. Mercer led. The cadets followed in a loose column behind him, and Gilles Trepanier walked at the back, alone, carrying nothing except his thermos and a pair of work gloves tucked into his belt. Cadet Vitale noted, without mentioning it, that he had not pulled out a map. The terrain at Gagetown in October is not forgiving. The base covers more than 1,100 square kilometers of mixed forest, wetland, and Canadian Shield outcropping, and the sector they were moving into, the Northwest Training Area, dead ground beyond the artillery ranges, is the kind of country that has a way of turning confident men around. The trails disappear. The ridgelines fold into each other. The light, when the cloud cover thickens, becomes directionless, and your shadow abandons you. And suddenly every stand of black spruce looks like every other stand of black spruce, and you are somewhere in 1,100 square kilometers, and you are beginning, quietly and without wanting to admit it, to feel the first edge of something uncomfortable. The forecast that morning had called for clear skies. By 10 o'clock the cloud was moving in off the Bay of Fundy, low and fast, and the temperature had dropped 6 degrees. Mercer checked his compass at the first waypoint. He checked the map. He was on track 40 minutes in, moving well. The cadets were keeping pace. He turned to check the column and saw Gilles Trepanier at the back, moving through the brush with a kind of unhurried precision that was, when you watched it, strangely affecting. His feet finding the dry ground without apparent effort. His route through the undergrowth marginally but consistently better than the route the cadets in front of him were taking. Shaving seconds off each obstacle without seeming to notice he was doing it. At the 2-hour mark, the weather changed properly. It came in from the northwest, which nobody had expected, and within 20 minutes the visibility was down to 30 meters. Not a true whiteout, the snow was light, but the kind of grey-white diffusion that erases landmarks and flattens the world into a featureless disk of pale nothing, and your compass becomes the only real thing you have. Mercer called a halt at a small granite outcropping he had been using as a reference point. He pulled out his map. He had been tracking their position carefully, and he was confident he knew where they were to within 200 meters. Grid 447-881 was approximately 3.5 kilometers northeast. In normal conditions, 90 minutes. In this, possibly 2 hours, possibly more. He was deciding how to proceed when Gilles Trepanier walked to the front of the column and stood beside him and looked out into the whiteness without saying anything. Mercer waited. "There's a creek bed," Gilles said, after a moment. "About 400 meters that way." He pointed north-northeast without looking at a compass. "Runs northeast for about 1.5 kilometers before it bends. The bend points straight at the high ground above the cache. You follow the bend, you're looking at maybe 50 meters of elevation gain, and then you're on it." Mercer looked at his map. There was a creek marked, more or less where Gilles was pointing. He looked at the man. "You know this sector?" Gilles looked at the map briefly. "I've been maintaining the access road out to that area for 11 years, he said, "and before that," he stopped. He seemed to reconsider. "I know the creek," he said instead. Cadet Ashby was standing close enough to hear this. He would think about that pause, and before that, for a long time afterward. They found the creek in 18 minutes, precisely where Gilles had said it would be. It was mostly frozen at the edges, still running dark in the center, and Gilles moved along its bank without hesitating, reading the ground the way certain people read a page. Without effort, without performance, just taking in information at a pace the terrain itself was offering. At one point, Vitale came up beside him. She had her compass out and was checking her bearing against the creek's course. "How do you know where the bend is?" she asked. Not challenging him, genuinely asking. He looked at her. "The water drains off the high ground to the northeast," he said. "The geology bends southeast here for about 2 kilometers before it opens. The creek has to follow it." He pointed to a slight change in the bank, a place where the ice had broken differently. "See how the current shifts? It's already turning." She saw it. It was very small, but it was there. "That's not on the map," she said. "No," he said, "it wouldn't be." They reached grid 447-881 at 13:12, 2 hours and 57 minutes from departure. Inside the window, The emergency cache was a weathered fiberglass box set into the base of a white spruce, marked with a reflective orange band that was nearly invisible under the snow accumulation. Mercer found it because he knew to look for it. The cadets found it because Mercer pointed it out. Giles had stopped 12 meters short and was standing with his back against a tree, drinking from his thermos facing west. Mercer walked over to him. "How long have you known about the cache?" he asked. Giles looked at him with something that was almost amusement. "Since they put it there," he said. "I helped carry the box in." Mercer was quiet for a moment. The snow was still coming, lighter now, and the forest had the particular quality of silence that snowfall brings to coniferous country, complete, close, like something held in. "Mr. Trepanier," he said, "I have to ask you something." Giles waited. "Before that," Mercer said, "you started to say something, before 11 years on the access road." The old man looked at the trees for a while. He drank from his thermos again. He seemed to be deciding something, the way a man decides how much of a thing to put down and how much to leave in his pockets. "I was with the Pipicili," he said finally. "Patricia's. 3rd Battalion." He said it the way you say the name of a place you grew up and left and don't go back to. Not with pride, not without it, just accurately. Mercer knew the regiment. He knew its history. He knew what 3rd Battalion had been through in the decade before the drawdowns. He did not say any of this. "Bosnia?" he asked. Giles turned his thermos in his hands. "Among other places," he said. There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable. Cadet Vitali, standing 12 meters away, had been watching this conversation without appearing to. She could not hear it, but she watched Mercer's face, and she watched the old man's face, and she saw something pass between the two of them that she didn't have the language for yet. Something that would take her years of her own service to be able to name properly. What she was watching was one soldier recognizing another across 30 years and the distance of rank and circumstance. Mercer said, "How long have you been in maintenance?" 8 years, Giles said. "After my wife passed, I needed something to do. The base was there." He shrugged with one shoulder. "It suited me." "You could have gone back into instruction," Mercer said. "With your background." "I had my years," Giles said, simply. "Someone else can have theirs." Mercer nodded. He looked out at the tree line for a moment. He thought about the cadet who had laughed. He thought about Ashby's remark. He thought, and this was the thought that stayed with him longest, about the 32 candidates standing in 2 rows, who had heard the same question, and not one of them had raised their hand, and this man, standing beside a maintenance truck with a thermos and a fuel filter, had raised his. Not because he was trying to prove anything, not to show them up, not for the acknowledgement. He had raised his hand because the question had a correct answer and he happened to know it. That was all. That was the whole of it. On the walk back, 3 hours in clearing weather, the sky opening up northeast the way maritime skies do, brutal and sudden and lovely. Mercer positioned himself beside Giles for much of the route. They did not talk continuously. That was not that kind of conversation. But Mercer asked questions, and Giles answered them, and what emerged across those 3 hours, in the intervals between silences, was the outline of a life that had never once announced itself. He had enlisted at 19, out of Chicoutimi, the second of 5 children, his father a mill worker who had done 2 years in Korea and come home and never discussed it. Giles had understood that silence as a kind of instruction. He had understood it the same way his father had given it, not as a wound but as a discipline. He had done 3 deployments. He had come home from each of them the way his father had come home from Korea, intact, quiet, and fundamentally uninterested in anyone's gratitude. He had married a woman named Elise, who had been, by every account he gave of her, both extraordinary and completely unimpressed by her own extraordinariness, which is the rarest combination a person can possess. He had raised 2 daughters in Oromocto, 6 kilometers from the gate of CFB Gagetown, in a house with a garden that his wife maintained with the same focused care she brought to everything, and when she died of a cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for, he had sat in the house for 1 winter and then called the base and asked if they needed anyone in maintenance. He said this all without self-pity and without false cheer, which is an achievement most people underestimate until they've tried it themselves. When they came out of the tree line and back onto the parade area, the sky had cleared completely and the light was long and flat and cold across the ground, the way late October light is in New Brunswick. Merciless and clean. Mercer stopped the column. He turned to face them. The cadets gathered up in a loose semicircle, and Giles stood at the edge of it, slightly apart. the way he had been slightly apart all day. Mercer did not make a speech. He was not a speech-making kind of officer. He said, "I asked a question this morning and none of you raised your hand. That's fine. You'll have days ahead of you when you'll know the answer and you won't raise your hand, and days when you'll raise your hand and not know the answer, and you'll learn to tell the difference. That's part of what you're here for." He paused. "But I want you to think about something. This morning, the person in this group who knew the terrain best, who had spent more hours in that specific piece of ground than all of you combined, was standing next to a maintenance truck." He did not gesture toward Gilles. He didn't need to. Every cadet knew exactly who he meant. He raised his hand once. Nobody asked him anything. And then I asked him, and he showed you something that 23 years of teaching land navigation didn't put in any briefing I've ever given. He looked at them. "The man who knows the ground isn't always the one with the rank to say so. Remember that. Carry it with you. It will matter." Cadet Ashby, who had laughed that morning, was looking at the ground. Cadet Vitale was not looking at the ground. She was looking at Gilles Trepanier, who was looking at the tree line again, the way he had been looking at the tree line when the day started, as if the whole thing, the navigation, the weather, the colonel's speech, the 32 cadets rearranging something in their minds, had been simply part of the regular passage of an October day in New Brunswick, no more or less remarkable than a fuel filter that needed changing. Before the group dispersed, Vitale walked over to him. She did not know exactly why. She had graduated top of her navigation practical, and she had a good instinct for when something was worth closing the distance toward. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. He had the kind of face that has been outdoors in all weathers for 50 years, a face that has made its accommodations with cold and wind and time, and what was in it now was not precisely warmth, but something adjacent to it, the recognition one careful person gives another when they see that the care has been noticed. "You read the creek right," he said. "Before I told you." She shook her head. "I saw it. I didn't know what it meant." "That's how it starts," he said. He picked up his thermos. He walked back to the maintenance truck. He got in, started the engine, and drove away toward the fuel depot on the far side of the base, and the sound of the truck diminished in the cold air and then was gone. Grant Mercer stood on the parade area and watched him go. There are men like Gilles Trepanier in almost every institution, if you know what to look for. They are not always old, though they often are. They are not always quiet, though they usually are. They have accumulated something over the course of their lives. Not knowledge exactly, because knowledge can be transmitted and tested and stored, but a different thing, a harder thing to name. A literacy of specific ground, an understanding of where water goes when it falls, and what ice tells you about current, and where the land bends before the map says it does. It is the kind of understanding that can only be built by being present, in a specific place, at a specific time, over and over and over again, until the place has been inside you in every season and every weather, and you have stopped needing to think about it and started simply knowing it, the way you know the layout of a room you've lived in long enough that you can move through it in complete darkness without touching anything. The cadets who were on Range 11 that day, there was no Range 11, of course. There was a northwest training sector and a creek and a fiberglass box under a white spruce, but the names don't matter. The place does. Those cadets completed their officer training in the months that followed and went out into the regiments, and some of them had careers, and some of them had wars, and some of them had both, and a few of them had neither, and went into other things. And the specific day in October came something they mentioned, now and then in different ways. Ashby mentioned it most often because he had laughed, and the laugh had stayed with him the way small acts of carelessness sometimes do. Not as a punishment, but as a reference point he kept returning to when he needed to recalibrate. Vitale mentioned it least because she had taken it inward and kept it there. She would spend her career paying attention to the person at the edge of the group. She would spend her career asking questions of the people nobody was asking questions of. She would find, with some regularity, that they knew where the water went. Gilles Trepanier worked in base maintenance at CFB Gagetown for 4 more years, until the winter that his younger daughter drove up from Moncton and said, with the particular directness of a person who loves you, and is finished pretending otherwise, that he was coming to live with her family now, and that was the end of the discussion. He did not argue. He loaded what he needed into 2 bags. He had always travelled light, and he left the house in Oromocto to his older daughter, and he went. He did not apply for any veterans recognition. He did not attend reunion events. He had a garden at his daughter's house in Moncton, a long, narrow strip along the south fence, and in it he grew the same things his wife had grown, kale and beans, and the particular variety of winter squash she had preferred. And in the evenings in good weather he sat in a wooden chair at the edge of it and watched the light change. Mercer retired from the Canadian Forces at the rank of colonel after 28 years. In the remarks he made at his retirement dinner, which were brief, he was still not a speech-making officer. He said one thing that his aide-de-camp wrote down afterward because it seemed worth keeping. He said, "The best piece of land navigation instruction I ever witnessed was given by a man who wasn't there to give instruction. He was there to change a fuel filter. The lesson was the same. When someone raises their hand to answer a question nobody else will answer, find out why before you decide what it means." He did not say Gilles Trepannier's name in the remarks. He didn't need to. Some names don't need to be spoken to be heard. Some men don't need the acknowledgement to have mattered. They have already done the thing. They carry the ground inside them. They know where the creek bends before the map says so. And on cold mornings in October, in the particular silence before a hard day begins, they are still out there, standing at the edge of things, holding their thermos, looking at the tree line, waiting to see if anyone is going to ask the right question.